Welcome, everybody, to the Beyond the Pivot podcast, a podcast that takes you on an adventure across Africa, bringing you insights on what's happening around different startup ecosystems on the continent. Here, as always, we try to break stereotypes about the good news or the bad news that happens around Africa, but bring you what's really happening on the ground. And so far, we've had amazing guests, and we're even more excited to bring you more guests on the podcast. Martin, how are you doing, and how are things going with you?
I'm doing very good. It's a beautiful January, and February, the shortest month, is in the winter. So that's very good because the winter is leaving us soon. What about you, Kapila? How are you doing?
Great, actually. It's been very rainy. So this is our rainy season. And as you know, we've been in this past situation where we're having blackouts as a country due to the drought that we had last year. But it's been raining heavily lately, which is good because our main source of power, which is our Kariba Dam, hopefully fills up. Though it's been projected, we need like 2 years of rainfall, good rainfall. Yeah, but it's generally good and work is flowing fine. Please tell us any news you have for us in the startup ecosystem, any of our startups or anything happening across the continent or Europe.
So I feel like we have a pretty big news for all of our 55 subscribers and everybody else who is not a subscriber yet and listening. Our former guest, Mansa Chalo, and his Duniya Healthcare made it to worldwide final of the World Summit Awards. So they will be one of the 40 projects from the whole world divided into 8 categories. And he is in the category of health. And he's going to be presenting next to 4 other projects, mostly from Asia and Europe. There will be only, I believe, 4 or 5 projects from Africa represented in this national final, and Cello is one of them. The final will be in Hyderabad, India, in I believe mid-March, and Hyderabad, they say, is the Silicon Valley of India. So I assume it's going to be a big deal, a lot of experiences, a lot of cool people to meet, and for Duniya Healthcare, I believe India is also where most of the medicines are manufactured as well. So I cannot wait for Chalo to tell us how the trip was. Who did he meet? Who did he see? How was that whole experience? So we want to wish him the best of luck to represent not only himself but also Zambia, because he's the first one out of Zambia that not only made it to the short list, but also to the international worldwide final. So congratulations to him. I think that's pretty big news, and we cannot wait for the journey to continue.
That's amazing news, Martin. And just for viewers' sake, I do know you were also a jury in one of the sectors that was selecting the startups. But just to be clear, you weren't part of the jury that was selecting startups in the healthcare space, right? Can you tell us about that experience quickly?
Yeah. So it was 4-day process where we had to decide in all 8 categories based on who the final is going to be. There were, I believe, 24 jurors from all around the world, from all the continents. And it was quite the experience to focus, to learn about all the awesome projects that were shortlisted. And as you said, I couldn't be the juror that decides about health tech because I had vested interest, let's say, in Duniya, because I know Cello. So I had to leave the room. So nobody can blame me for doing some unfair advantages there. Other jurors that you might know were, for example, TD, that we had as a guest in one of our latest episodes as well. So that's where I met him in the person, and then just by complete coincidence, we recorded an episode with him afterwards. But enough of this news. Kapila, what is happening in our episode today?
Great stuff. I mean, it was amazing. Firstly, I'm jealous that you even had to meet TD in person, but we can talk about that later. Today, exciting episode. I'm super excited about the guests that we have, as I'm always excited about the guests that we have on every episode. Yes, I am always, because they just drop so many golden nuggets about the ecosystem, and I'm always learning and curious to learn what their investment strategy is, if it's for the startups, what their mission and problem is. Today's episode, we are talking to Haïle Amegashie from Breega Capital. It's based in France. And basically, they have a $75 million fund that's dedicated towards Africa. And so, in this episode today, we will be learning about Haïle's background, how he moved from being an entrepreneur to where he is now in the investment landscape, and what their focus is really on the continent and their strategy to deploying capital on the African continent. I think in this episode, we will be asking everything to what is their value proposition as a fund, what do they care about, what does investment look like, and what kind of support do they really provide startups, and what makes them special compared to all of these VC firms that we have coming up on the African continent. So looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward and excited about the conversation. So please enjoy. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Beyond the Pivot podcast, a podcast that brings you insights about the entrepreneur ecosystem across Africa. We bring you startup news, funding news, and present to you guests that are working in the space to actually build the African tech and entrepreneur ecosystem. Today, I'm super excited. I have my amazing guest, Haïle Amegashie. He's from Breega, which is based in France. And basically, they are a VC firm that have interest in Europe, Africa, and other emerging markets. They have invested in 7 African startups currently. Please correct me, Haïle, if I'm wrong. But they have invested in 7 African startups, and they have quite a unique approach towards supporting entrepreneurs. We'll delve deep into that, and I think it fits within some of the conversations that we've been having when it comes to funding and supporting entrepreneurs on the continent. It's not just so much about capital, but also the support that you get to provide the founders. Haïle, welcome to the Beyond the Pivot podcast.
Hello, Kabula. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to have the honor of speaking on your podcast today, and I'm very happy to share some insights and especially talk about what we do at Breega and try and build and support entrepreneurs on the continent.
Awesome. Yes, I'm super excited. And for our viewers to know, Haïle is also an entrepreneur, and he currently has moved into the VC space as he's done quite a number of roles in the capital space, and now he's settled at Breega. And just starting with Breega, Haïle, or even before we even start with Breega, I would like to know about your entrepreneurship journey. I think one thing that you're big on at Breega is the fact that you are founders and you're supporting founders, right? So tell me about your entrepreneurship journey when you were building the logistics company providing last mile delivery services. What's that about? And can you give us some description of what that experience was like?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, my DNA has founder blood in it. Both my parents are entrepreneurs, and I'd always been told as a child, go and learn a job and skills, but make sure that you build something for yourself. I built a company called Zemi 2021. This is post-COVID, and on the backbone of me realizing that e-commerce was a growing thing post-COVID, but the infrastructure required to make e-commerce available to people on the continent was lacking. The number one thing was lack of, addressing systems on the continent. Thought about, resolving that problem. So how do we actually create virtual addresses or whatsoever? A few startups were doing this both in the US and the UK. So the famous one is called 3 Words. Addresses are normally, linked to your phone number or someone's name. So when that person leaves, that house no longer exists on the network. Then the question became, what is the most important thing for an end user that orders stuff online? And that is getting their package as quickly as possible in their hands. And then we kind of looked with my co-founders at the problem from the other side. So we said, how can we get packages as quickly as possible, as cost effectively as possible in people's hands? And basically we said we are going to bring customers to their packages instead of bringing the package to customers. In very simple terms, we basically leverage an API which we plugged into the likes of the Jumiyas, the Take-A-Lots, and we were a delivery option, physical delivery option, where people could use and leverage our network of Fudo lockers, which are available 24 hours a day. And basically, these were put in petrol stations, schools, malls, etc. And it just made that journey much easier, much simpler for end users. We were very ambitious, and unfortunately, there's a chicken and egg problem that, arose where people will use your network insofar as you have more lockers and you need more lockers in order to bring the people onto the platform. We realized after 9 months that it was going to be very hard to scale this, with the right unit economics, for two reasons. One, 85% of people on the continent still want to pay cash on delivery. This means that they will order something online and they're only willing to pay for it once they've seen it or they have a guarantee that it's there. And that stems from, trust issues because in the past, they've been duped. What this meant is that the tech element that we had basically could not deploy its full value because then people wanted someone to be there to give them change, etc. Oh, we had to build like a bill validator within our lockers. Experimented that, but obviously very hard to scale that effectively. And the other problem that we experienced was vandalism, right? Once people know that there's a phone, a tablet, potential shoes, etc., out of desperation, you're going to try and do something. And as a company, as soon as those goods were handed to us, we then became liable for anything that would happen between the time we handled them and the end user came and collected it. So that created a lot of liability, and we decided that, it was very complicated to scale, but we have learned a lot about the markets and e-commerce and how to enable that. And then after that, after a year and so, I asked myself, what's next? Do I go back to the investing world where I come from, or do I continue building? And I said to myself, I am a US citizen, and there was the opportunity for me to go to the US, in New York especially, an environment where you have a startup ecosystem that is very mature and you can build big businesses. So I stayed in my lane, which was e-commerce, or at least e-commerce enablement, and joined the CEO and founder of Adore Me, US women's D2C company, who built a health and wellness e-commerce selling supplements and vitamins. So I was head of operations there, stayed there for a year and a half, built a team of 20 people. Very, very interesting to see the different dynamics between the US and the countries I was operating in on the continent. And kind of like the deal there was, I stayed there for 2 years to learn and really got my hands really scrappy. So from coding to hiring to managing operations, I got the opportunity to do all of that. And after a year and a half, I said, it's all fun and games to be selling supplements for people in the US, but I had an issue with my why and the reasons I was doing it. And I wanted to come back to the continent. And that was to found again. And then I stumbled upon Breega really randomly, going to African Venture Capital Association conference last year, and stumbled upon the head of Africa, the partner, Melvin Lubega. We just had a random conversation talking about my journey, what I wanted to do next, and he was like, we're hiring, right? And I had always said, it's important to want to start a business, but it's also important to get to learn what other people are doing, to see what models work, what models don't work, and having built a business in the US does not guarantee you success on the continent. It's actually more of the opposite because you come with your biases, right?
Please say that again so that I just get it perfectly, Haïlé.
Yeah, I definitely think, copy pasting models that you've seen in the West does not guarantee you success on the continent. And we have to be very conscious and wary of that as people that have studied abroad, that have had experiences abroad and built abroad. You have to adapt yourself to the local realities, local hurdles, and those differ from country to country, from industry to industry. And then timing is also a big factor. So that idea of getting into VC was lingering in my head, and you have two tracks. You have the people that go to investment banking for a few years and then transition to venture capital. You have the people that have been operators, have been founders, and venture capital firms like and value that experience. And I guess it was a natural fit. And the reason I did eventually join Breega was because Breega's investment team is only previous founders or startup operators, right? And what that means, and I don't like using the word founder friendly because I think it's a buzzword, but what it means is that we understand what it is to go through the journey of being a founder. We know how hard it is. We understand how complicated and cumbersome the fundraising process is. And we try and make that as easy as possible. So we say yes as quickly as possible, but we also say no as quickly as possible. And our fundamental objective is for every founder that we speak to come out of a discussion with something that puts them in a better situation or position to achieve their goals. Whether it's an introduction, whether it's a strategic reflection, whether it's us helping them see that certain points are going to make it hard to scale and they pivot, or it's investing, right? And then on top of that, we have an internal scaling squad, right? Which is a dedicated team of 10 people that are all former operators or founders as well, and that help on different verticals. So we have one that's branding and communications. The other is hiring, right? Recruitment. I want to say the biggest pitfall and the biggest mistakes founders make in general, but on the continent, is hire the wrong people for the wrong job. And I'll give an example. Saying I'm starting a startup in fintech and going to hire someone that's been at Goldman Sachs for 10 years does not make that person the right fit to be a CFO, right? Because they are used to be working in a very structured environment. They're used to be working in an environment, where there is access to capital, where they're only asked to do a certain number of things. And now, there's a whole palette of things they have to get acquainted with. So we help you from that perspective. We also have a growth hacking team, and then anything that has to do with strategic thinking, etc. And on top of that, we are on the board.
And just there, thanks for that. I think you've given quite a comprehensive overview and background, I think, from your childhood and how you found yourself in this space. And there are multiple things I could double click on. I'm like, Haïlé, firstly, can I go back to your childhood again? Is there something we can pick on there? Maybe let me start from there before I come to my other points where I think you brought up very good insights. So from your background, right? We always try to figure out, like, are entrepreneurs just born or are they made, right? Or do you just get to fake it until you become an entrepreneur? How did that experience, especially with your parents, both being entrepreneurs, shape you? Because I would like to imagine the life of an entrepreneur or founders, as you know, they're quite busy and they might not be as present, right? And so I'm trying to imagine what that experience was for you and how it shaped you in this passion and belief to support entrepreneurs across the continent. Could you just speak more to that, and then we'll get back to your work?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think I can answer the question generally to whether or not entrepreneurs are made or they're born like that. But for me, it was always a question of, my mom. I have a single mother that has been her own boss since she's 22, and she was able to balance being an entrepreneur and being a parent, being a present parent. When I say present, doesn't necessarily have to be in person, but never had the impression that she wasn't there. And that's the example that I've always had. Hard work. I never envisioned work or career as Monday to Friday thing. There was always, well, we're supposed to go on vacation, and 2 days before, sorry guys, I have to cancel. So I've been brought up in that environment and that mindset, and I think coupled with that, her being a single mother and giving us the mindset that you have to do things at all costs. You don't really have a choice, right? And essentially that's what it is. Being an entrepreneur is you're going to do things that you don't necessarily like, but you have to do them because there's no other choice. And I think that also I've been big on sport, played high-level tennis and rugby, having grown up in South Africa. And I think the values that I've learned through sports have shaped my character with regard to overachieving, being able to stick to a plan, and being driven. And I've always been a person that liked operational stuff, right? So in group projects or in team assignments, always a person that like being the operational guy, right? Okay, how do we make things happen? What is retro planning? How do we make sure we're on schedule, et cetera, et cetera. So I've always had a love for that, right? So Africa, I've always been passionate by the African. I studied African studies, political science, and finance. And I've always been fascinated by the power of technology and how it helps solve problems. Africa lags behind on multiple fronts, but technology has also allowed us to leapfrog in certain domains. And the example I always take is M-Pesa, right? I was still young at the time, but I was fascinated by the fact that people went from one having 0 phones to having house phones, landlines, to having 2 or 3 smartphones, to having 0 bank accounts, and now being able to send money virtually. And so very early on, I was fascinated by understanding the power that technology could have in enabling and unlocking certain sectors and alleviating multiple of the problems that we have on the continent. So yeah, in university and college, I was always in the tech club and the entrepreneurship society, volunteering for startups, et cetera, et cetera. So I've always had that in me. And essentially I like challenges, right? I think that's one thing that I love. I enjoy challenges. I get really bored when things are easy. I like challenges, and I like putting my mind, my body, my effort to it in order to reach a certain goal. So I think that's where that stems from, and it's in me for the rest of my life.
Thank you for that, Haïlé. And tying that now to your passion with the African continent, and I think this ties to your work as well, right? You're working in multiple markets. There's the European side and there's the African side. And now double clicking on what you talked about, which is the copy and pasting, right, of solutions from one particular market or region into Africa. How do you make sure you balance that out, especially as you work with entrepreneurs from the different markets? Because I would like to imagine could be quite tempting. You see a solution working in Europe or in one of the other markets where you're in, and you somehow want that to work for Africa. Like, how do you strike that balance as you work with the founders?
So for us, key elements of Breega is being humble, right? And I don't use that word lightly because it is not because we have individually been able to build to a certain extent businesses that it makes us more legitimate than anyone else to give advice, right? What we do know is that we don't know, and we're here to learn and listen to entrepreneurs first. What we say about copy and pasting is that we're not saying you shouldn't look at what has been done in Europe, in America, Southeast Asia, is learn from others, and try and identify the patterns, the processes that have allowed for tech ecosystems to elope, but also for those tech ecosystems to drive real impact on solving real problems, right? So one thing that we do at Breega and the Africa Fund is trying to understand what was done in terms of policies in India, in Brazil, in Indonesia, that's made it that they were able to attract talent, they were able to go through the right policies, and then able to resolve real problems that, were beforehand non-resolvable without tech. It's also understanding that, and I always say this, I live in Nigeria today, and a lot of people chase the buzzwords. So everyone will say, I'm doing AI for this or crypto for this. There is one reality, is that in a lot of African countries, the baseline infrastructure is not there, right? You cannot talk to me about AI when in Nigeria, for example, we have maximum 6.5 hours of electricity a day, right? So our question is, and this is part of our investment process, when someone pitches to us is, are you solving a real problem? And the way we answer that question is your solution a must-have or a nice-to-have, right? Are you going to significantly impact and change people's livelihoods or not? And again, this could be seen as a subjective way to look at things, but I'll give you one example. Lagos has about 20 million people, right, living in Nigeria, in Lagos. I think there are about 3 to 5 million people that commute between what we call mainland and the islands in Lagos. Lagos also has water around, right? And you ask yourself, the reputation that people that have never been to Nigeria have is like, yeah, we know that Lagos is the most populous city in Nigeria, and there's traffic. People spend on average 6 hours a day going and coming back to work. Why? My question today is, why has no entrepreneur thought of creating an Uber-like way that allows people to commute but on water, right? That for me is a much greater opportunity than someone that comes to me and says, I'm going to use AI to optimize payments, right? So there is that pressing problem that, money has to go first and foremost to solving baseline problems: electricity, food, education. Once you've done that, you can look at other things. But ultimately, technology should only be seen and used as a vector to optimize processes that allow you to solve a problem that multiple people are facing on a daily basis. And that's why we say we don't only invest in tech, but we invest in digitally enabled businesses, right?
Yep.
Essentially, I think with the logistics space is the best way to look at it, is how do I take a manual process that is working and how do I make it 10 times, 20 times, 100 times faster and more efficient in order for that to have, a greater impact. But if the baseline and underlying understanding of how that industry, how that process works is not understood and mastered, you can put as much technology, as much AI, crypto, whatsoever. It's not going to change anything. Right.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think there is a lot of work that we need to do to build the baseline infrastructure, or at least solving the baseline problems. And this is similar and common across multiple African markets. You mentioned the African Fund. I'd like you to speak to that a bit more. How big is this fund? I know currently you've invested in about 7 African startups. What's driving Breega's interest in Africa?
Yeah, so the Africa Fund is fairly new. We announced it in July 2024. It is a $75 million fund. Breega is sector agnostic, so we do not invest in verticals, but more in people and opportunities. We invest tickets anywhere from $100,000 to $2 million. So pre-seed and seed. And in some instances, we can do pre-series A, but it's more us doubling down on some of our portfolio companies. What drives our interest for the African continent? I mean, frankly, the continent is the only one today that presents growth opportunities from, the problems to be solved, but also the population, right? Emerging markets and frontier markets are interest for VCs. And if you look at, the different ecosystems, some of them have grown to be huge tech hubs today. I take India, I take Brazil. Those are great examples. Again, our focus is always solving problems, right? Is what is the underlying problem that you're solving, and how is tech allowing you to solve that problem better, faster, or at a cheaper cost than, the status quo or the incumbents? That's frankly what we're looking at. I think the VC industry on the continent is quite nascent compared to, like, if you take the US or a number of European countries, the UK, France, Germany, Switzerland. But that also creates an opportunity, right? It allows investment professionals to draw from the lessons, the mistakes, the experience of those ecosystems, and start to craft a localized approach to venture capital investments on the continent. It is also the right timing today because in the Africa Fund, for example, the 2 partners for Africa, one, his name is Melvin Lubega. He's built a unicorn called Go1, and Tosin Fanrudada, who was the head of Endeavor Nigeria and has deep understanding of, the tech ecosystem in Nigeria and West Africa. She worked with the Pagas, the Flutterwaves, etc. We are in a position to back founders that know better than we do the environments in which they're trying to solve problems. We are just an enabler. We're a sparring partner. We're someone that's here to give you some structure, to motivate you, to give you some advice when you ask for it. And I think that it's important. There is this fallacy, right, that every problem should be solved by government. And you go to a number of African cities and you're like, there are no roads, there are no whatsoever. Okay, government has a role to play, but SMEs are the backbone of a country's economy. And you have to be able to fuel those SMEs, right? And not them being just for subsistence, but them actually being able to solve a problem, make money, reinvest that money, grow, create jobs, etc. And I think that, every asset class has a role to play. There's, there are debt players, are private equity players, they are banks, they are VC firms, and we each have to play our role. And obviously, at different stages and different types of businesses need a mix or combination of a number of those instruments. But for us, we believe that, Africa presents an opportunity. And again, we're in a business where we have to say no to 99% of businesses. And that's the reality of it. But today we want to be, and that's a motto in-house, we want to be the investors we wish we had when we were building. We don't believe that it's normal for someone in Lusaka to have to go to San Francisco and go to YC in order to raise money, right? Today, there are VCs on the continent. Yes, they may not be in every market physically, but at least there are a number of VCs that have a footprint with the local teams on the continent, right? And with the help of technology, I do not want a Zambian entrepreneur to say, I have less chances to speak to a Breega because they don't have an office in Lusaka. No, we're here and we can talk to you, we can come and see you, you can meet us. And that's the most important thing. People have to know that there is access to capital. And we have to be able to know that they are entrepreneurs that are building great businesses and just don't have access to capital. And what it also does, right, and why we believe that, African VC has to develop itself locally is for far too long, a lot of US VC firms saw Africa as an alternative, right, for potential higher returns, etc. The truth of the matter is that you see fluctuations in the number of VC firms that invest depending on if there is a recession in the US or not. Access to capital, we believe, should not be a consequence of things not being okay in the US, right? So we have an Africa fund. We're dedicating that fund to investing in African entrepreneurs. Whether or not there is a recession in the US or not, entrepreneurs should be able to come to us, pitch, and convince us that they're building a solid business that is going to grow and that is going to turn profitable, but most importantly, is going to have an impact on a significant amount of people. And I think that's super important, is that now you're also seeing more and more founders saying, we actually want an African VC on our cap table because you understand the reality. I'll give you an example. Most VCs invest in hard currency. If you take Nigeria, the Naira has devalued over the last year, right? Let's call it went from 400 to 1,600 in a year. Petrol prices have 3x since October 2024. You can't hold it against an entrepreneur that's navigating that ecosystem and can't hit the milestones and the metrics they're asking for. We understand that, right? So when we're investing in a company, we take all those factors into account, and you have to consider them. And I think that's extremely important because it also has an impact on valuation, right? You see way too many people that go to Y Combinator, or these great opportunities and incubators across the world, And then they finish and they're given, a 30 million, 40 million valuation. And they come back and they raise on that valuation. And then 2 years after, they take a huge haircut because obviously, they haven't reached their milestones and the market says otherwise. We're very big and very adamant on equity story at Breega. So it is not because you have a great product and that's another VC said, we're giving you a 20 million valuation that we're going to invest. For us, the most important thing as an early stage venture capital, our objective is to be the catalyst for you to then be able to go and raise more money at the next stage. And it's a win-win for everybody. So we're very, very cautious of that. And that's a message that we send to all the founders on the continent is just know that there is VC firms that are very optimistic about the ecosystem on the continent that are contributing to making it better, more accessible, and more efficient, and that you should come and see us.
Thanks for that, Haïlé. And so, speaking to the startups that you've currently invested in on the continent, are there any successes that you would highlight based on your interactions with them and investments that you've made? And you could put it in a way that could be lessons that other investors or entrepreneurs can learn based on the successful investments that you've made.
In our in-house philosophy of being humble, you make a decision with the information that you have available at the time that you're making the investment. The only way to know if you made the right choice is to wait, right? I could tell you, yes, every single investment we made, we believe is going to be a unicorn.
Yep.
The truth of the matter is that statistically, that is not possible. You have to wait. So there's a 5-year period where you deploy the capital and then you wait, right? And you support the companies and you help them grow. What I can say is that we are very happy with our portfolio companies. We've doubled down on a few of them, and that's our strategy, right? VC is all about, betting, and then you see what works, what doesn't work. So that's our strategy. Essentially, we invest at pre-seed, and if, we're very happy and convinced, then we will double down at seed. And we've done this with a number of our investments, Socium, Sava, Numida, and these are, different countries. Numida is a credit provider for uncollateralized loans in Uganda. Sava is a neobank in South Africa, and Socium is an HR management platform in Senegal. And this also shows that, one, we're sector agnostic. Two, we're not scared to go to markets that are not the hot markets, from a mainstream perspective, like Uganda. To your point earlier, could have been considered a small market, etc. But ultimately, people still face the same problems. People still need access to capital, and you need to resolve that. And technology allows entrepreneurs to do that, and we're very happy. So, to answer your question, I would say that, time has power, and we have to let time determine whether or not we were right in making our investments. And that's true for any investor. We know what we know, but we also know that we don't know, and things can change. A lot of factors determine whether or not you're successful or not. I would say the biggest focus that firms like Breega, but most tier 1 firms on the continent are focused on right now is exits. It is important to understand that as a VC, we are an investor, but we also have our own investment. And we have a fiduciary obligation to provide returns to our investors. So we have to invest in companies we believe can provide those returns. That also means that at the time we invest, we also have to reflect on what are the potential exit opportunities. Do we want IPOs in billion-dollar companies? Of course we want them. The truth of the matter is, Africa has 9 today, I believe, with MoneyPoint and Time Bank, it's 9. But how many real IPOs have we seen, right? Not much. So we have to think about how is it that we are allowing companies to grow, consolidate, sell to other larger groups that see it as a strategic investment in order to prove that the model works. Paystack has shown that, right? Paystack sold after 2 years for $200 million. So whoever invested at pre-seed or seed, right, they've made a 20x plus on that investment, which is great. So I think that we should not necessarily chase for unicorns. Do we want unicorns? Of course. I'm not going to say no as an investor, but I think that we should be more focused on what are the realistic, attainable exit opportunities on the continent. And that's what we work hand in hand with ecosystem builders, other funds, policymakers to think about that, right? What bigger group can buy a fintech, or what bigger group can buy a logistics player because they have something that would make their process better and create synergies. And those are reflections that we have to have from the beginning. You know, Daystar Power in Nigeria sold to Shell for north of 200 million, right? And they were solving the grid problem in Nigeria. So that's the way we think and we reflect. And as I said, you know, we believe that at the time that we make our decisions, we've made the right one. And things change, events, policies, you know, leadership and vision that changes within companies. But with the experience that Breega has built in Europe over the last 10 years and the use of the scaling squad, we believe that's one of Breega's secret weapons, right? Is being there at every step of the way. You know, we have playbooks for every kind of situation or problem a first-time founder will encounter. So, give you an example. You don't know how to do ESOP, right, which is stock option pool for your employees. We have playbooks that help you do that with templates. Maybe you're a technical founder and you don't know how to do accounting for your startup. Well, we have tools to help you do that. And once we invest in you, you have access to what we call our scale room, where you have, you know, a myriad of different resources that you can use. You could be very autonomous, but you could also have, you know, weekly, bi-weekly touch points with the scaling squad and the chief scaling officer.
Like, you know, as you were speaking, I was going to bring you to the scaling squad. Firstly, I love the name of that team. I'd like to be part of a scaling squad. They just sound badass, and that's great. Tell me about that. Who's exactly on the scaling squad? Is it the same where you talk about ex-founders that are also trying to build these entrepreneurs? Because some challenge that we always find, and I'll just give you context to this, and this is in line with some of the programs that we run at Bongo Hive, which is the innovation technology and innovation hub where I work, is we do have founders with great products, but sometimes the challenge is them seeing a bigger vision, right? Having ambition to see Africa or the entire globe as their market, right? How does a scaling squad work with these entrepreneurs to just either grow their ambition or even just reach broader markets for the products and services that they offer?
So, you know, going back to our previous point on this, we believe that the scaling squad is Breega's secret weapon since day one. It's an in-house team of 10 people, which is fully funded by Breega, by the way. It's about 40% of Breega's budget goes into the scaling squad. And these people work, 40%. 40. Okay. And this is a team of operators specialized in their different fields that, you know, will directly assist founders in the C levels to build strong, lasting foundations for businesses to be able to go through hard and difficult moments. Like a house, if the foundation is strong, then you have more probability of lasting, regardless of what is thrown at you. So with a verticalized approach, spanning from strategy, growth, talent, brand, financial structuring, ESG, we're big on ESG, we provide, in aggregate with that team, a 360-degree expertise that's often missing for early stage startups and growth. Who are these people? These are ex-founders, ex-operators that were heads of brands, that were accounts executives, that were sales, that were consultants, that were heads of HR at big corporates, at startups. We have a chief scaling officer that's worked in finance, that's worked in mining operations, that's worked in petrol, and these are people that have worked in different sectors, but also different geographies, and that understand the importance of understanding the local realities. How do people have access to this is literally have something called the scaling room. And that is, as soon as you become a portfolio company, you have access to it. It is constantly updated. It's constantly optimized. And yeah, I'll give you an example. We recently did a project where the scaling team and the chief growth manager went to optimize the output of one of our portfolio companies' sales milestones, right? How do you just by virtue of understanding the flow and using data, make sure that the sales team is focusing on the right leads in order to close them, right? And, small incremental changes done diligently with discipline and consistently will yield strong results in the end. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. I would say the other thing is that two of those members in the scaling squad are master coaches. So part of being a founder is you have to be a little crazy, right? You have to believe so much in what you're doing and be willing to not count the hours. But it's also important that you have people that are able to, you're constantly solving problems, right, as a founder. But no one really takes time to think of you and asking how you're doing, right? So we have two master coaches that help founders understand their strengths, their weaknesses, how to manage their energies, right? And just how to become better C-suites, better leaders, better visionaries, and learn how to delegate still by giving and transmitting your vision in the most effective way from an energy perspective.
Thanks for that perspective. Makes sense. I mean, I totally believe in that. I remember trying to build my first business. You're at this point where, like, I've heard of building processes within my company or organization. What's the first process that I need to focus on? Is it sales? Am I focusing on finance, operations? And I do see the value, and I think other founders as well listening would find that valuable. I know this also ties to what we've been talking from an angel investor perspective. I know you're in the VC space, but even from the angel investor perspective, where there's this mentor driven approach that we've been talking about with our former guest on the podcast as well, where you get to offer support again beyond just the finances.
Well, one other thing we do, right? We think that the best value that a founder can get is anyone that becomes a portfolio company at Breega can speak to the other founders, right? And we make it a priority to make sure that we create that environment where if I'm building a fintech in Zambia and that there's another company in the portfolio that's built this in the UK and France, that I can actually speak to them. Maybe they raise a Series A or Series B and they're already making revenue. They have gone through the same hurdles for different ones, but you get to speak to them and say in hindsight, what would you have done? What did you learn from that experience? What advice can you give me? A lot of it is companies that have gone from pivoting from a B2C solution to a B2B solution. It is not the same way to approach the problem. It's not the same way to approach sales. The sales cycles are generally longer. But how do you navigate that change? How do you upskill to make that happen? How do you hire in order to make sure that you're solving for the right problem? And that's one thing and one environment we try to create.
Thanks for adding that. And how do you find pipeline? I know most likely entrepreneurs are reaching out to you, but how do you go about finding these investment worthy startups on the continent? And are there any challenges as you seek to find these entrepreneurs?
No, definitely. We have two types of pipeline sources. So one is we call inbound. So it's people reaching out to us. And on our website, we have what we call a type form. So people put in their name, their company's name, the value proposition, put a deck, answer a short questionnaire, and that comes in straight into our CRM. And we review that on a daily, weekly basis. And on the basis of our selection criteria, we take a call or we give feedback. But one thing we do is that we always give feedback to people that have reached out and have sent us their decks. Then we have inbound that comes from other VCs, right? It could be VCs that we've invested with before, VCs that we have good relationships with, that we've co-invested with, that will say, hey, I'm working on this deal, you should look at it. Or I've looked at these guys, but unfortunately it's a conflict to one of my portfolio companies. I think it's worth you looking. It could also be these guys are too early stage or too late stage for me. Here's their deck, you should talk. So a big part of my job is keeping bi-monthly or monthly touch points with other investors across the board on the continent. And we share a deal flow. This is a people's business, right? And
Absolutely.
you have to give before you're willing to take. Because one thing that's for sure, no VC will ever be able to invest in companies on their own. You need other VCs on board, right? So you want to build that community of people you can work with, that you can trust, and that you can share opportunities with. Then the other part that we look at is what we call outbound, right? And we've built a process where any person that's on the African continent, that's affiliated to the African continent, that's gone to a certain school, that's worked at a certain company, either big corporates or previous startup, and that's moved to stealth on like LinkedIn, for example, we're able to reach out to them pretty easily, right? And we do that. And then I would say the best form of pipeline is, and we get this a lot at Breega, is founders we've spoken to, that we've invested in, but most importantly, founders we've not invested in, but that say, listen, they've not given me any money, but we've had a great discussion. They're very respectful of my time. They made an intro. They helped me pivot. Whether or not they invest in you, you should speak to them. And for us, that's the best form of pipeline, right? The word of mouth is, we want to be the first option or first options when a founder is like, okay, I've written my idea on paper. Let me put together a deck. And now I'm going to start. I need seed funding. Breega are top of my list. That's our objective, right? So obviously we go to roadshows, we go to events. But yeah, and with everything in life, right? It's basically sourcing and scouting. It's hard, right? Because you are in a market that's smaller than, at least from a VC ecosystem perspective, that's smaller than, other ones in Europe and in North America. And you're competing with other firms, right? So again, back to our principle of humility, we know that we're never going to get everything. And we just have the ambition to say we want to be able to see every deal on the African continent. And not by virtue of being a cowboy and, pushing. It's just, we have to be authentic, we have to be honest, and we have to be collaborative with the rest of the ecosystem players so that we build a bond, we build a relationship that allows us to work hand in hand. So it's like, I will share deals with people, right? And I would say, here are the decks, we've spoken to them. I think you should speak to them because, this fits your scope, or we could co-invest, etc., etc. And as peers, they would call us and say, why did you take a pass on them? Or what did you guys see in them that we're not seeing because, we're not really convinced. And at the end of the day, as an investor, we have an opinion, and we know that that's a subjective one. We're not a sole investor. And we make decisions based on, our understanding, our stance. And that doesn't mean that we're right, and it doesn't mean that if we don't invest, that the company is not worthy of investment. So yeah.
And before I ask my last question, what do you think needs to change? Because when you look at the statistics right now, for Europe last year, investments were at about 41 billion. And for Africa, just about 2.3, 2.1 billion US dollars. And if Africa was going to aim to be at par with either Europe or even just other emerging markets like South America, what do you think needs to change or happen in order for us to see that investment flowing into the continent?
I think the number one thing is, one, be patient, right? Good things take time to build. Rome wasn't built in one day. So let's not forget that those ecosystems were built over years. We're looking at Silicon Valley today, but it wasn't rosy all the time. So it takes time. I think that we need to see more exits, more successful exits that will give trust into the markets. And when I say markets, is ultimately, as a VC firm, we have to go and find investors that invest in us and believe and trust us enough to make the returns. So it's your track record. And I think that ultimately we need to see more African capital coming into VCs, right? A lot of the LPs today are, and the great majority, not African institutions or high net worth individuals. And the question is, how do we make that happen? How do we create the enabling environment, a trustworthy environment that people believe that, it's better to put their money on the continent than somewhere else? And I think that it's also not trying to impose a foreign approach of doing VC, right? You have to do what works, and you have to invest the money where it has the greatest impact. And that then requires for investment firms to also tweak their mentality and understand that you can't be looking at the same metrics, or you have to caveat the way you look at the metrics, because there are things that are not similar or are completely novel and different in the different African countries that we invest in. And then ultimately, I think that, and that's happening already, you have more and more African entrepreneurs, diasporan Africans, that are coming back and saying, listen, we've worked for a couple of years, we've studied for a couple of years in the developed world, and now we want to build. And that's a good thing. We're seeing that more and more. And these are people that have had the same exposure, that have been to San Francisco, that have worked at the Google, that have worked at the Amazons, and that have that experience and have the technical know-how and experience to come and adapt and solve problems on the continent. And I think that's a great thing. So we have to encourage it. And lastly, I would say this ecosystem is never going to elope and develop to the level we want it to be if entrepreneurs, investors, policymakers / governments don't work hand in hand, right? The right policies have to be put in place. I'll give you one example. We cannot complain about flow of money not being on par with Europe when it is complicated for an East African to go to West African country and vice versa. So we also, creating businesses is also creating jobs for people. And there shouldn't be no hindrance at all for people to move, right? And I think that it starts with, how do we make sure that a country becomes attractive from a ease of doing business point of view? How do we make sure that we create the right processes for people to get visas if you need to get a visa? How do I make sure that I have this very talented CTO or head of engineering that I want to bring in, but it's complicated for him to get papers and to be legal to work in certain countries? How do we make that process easy? How do we make it easy for people to be interconnected? That will create the hubs. That will bridge the gaps that you have amongst Francophone West Africa, Anglophone West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, Southern Africa. And once you're going to have people that can, regardless of where they come from, have the opportunity to work where they want to work because they see opportunities, I think that will unlock a lot of the potential. And you're going to see more and more businesses across the continent, across the board, across round sizes, and you will no longer have this Zambia is too small, etc. Yes, Zambia as a country may be small. Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa as a block, North Africa as a block are big markets. And the question is, how do you transcend the borders of a country in order to solve a problem that is peculiar to multiple people and that cut across different countries, different geographies? And I think that's where the reflection and the focus has to be, and continue to learn is constantly is, what are we doing? What's the data saying, right? The empirical data is there. Use it, not to distort it, but to say, hey, this is the reality. What is it that we're doing year on year? Are we seeing an increase in funding? Yes, over the past 10 years, that is true, right? But how do we make sure it's a straight line up and no fluctuations in the middle? And I think that as an ecosystem, we've created and built the right forums and events to have a discussion. And it's not only let's meet once a year to do it. Let's meet once a year. Let's have a discussion, a recommendations list, a call to action, and actually contribute, each and every one of us, to making that goal more and more reality as we go.
Super insightful. And if I can try to just bring that all together, I think you speak about patience. Rome was not built in one day, and I think there's need for collaborative efforts towards building ecosystems on the continent where policymakers, entrepreneur support organizations, VCs collaborating and working together to support entrepreneurs. And I think you also speak to this aspect, and I think this has been very consistent throughout the episode, the case of solving base problems. And this could be in country, but also at a continental scale. For example, the issue of travel, right? Money transfer across continents, and focusing on that to see how best now we can see possible exits and successes across the ecosystems on the continent. Thank you so much for that. In closing, my last question to you is, personally or even at Breega, what excites you about the future of VC on the continent? And are there any technologies, I won't say trends, because I don't think you focus on trends. I think you've highlighted the value of that. But what technologies and sectors are you also keeping an eye on in the future?
Again, as a fund, we're inherently sector agnostic, and you would see that more often than not, most funding is in fintechs. That's what's worked on the continent, and more we're seeing more cleantech companies getting funding, and I see that as a very positive sign. Is that the challenges that Africans in Africa faces are double-fold. There's one that is development, but it's also you have to take into account sustainable development, clean development. How do we give access to energy, but that energy has to be clean? How is the process of that energy being clean being built? And technology allows you to do that, right? Education is a sector that's extremely important. Agriculture. How does technology help transform the agriculture sector? Transport, right? Transport tech. A lot of people would tell you there's too much fintech on the continent. The truth of the matter is that there's still a lot of people that don't have access to banks. How do we make that happen, right? Neobanks are emerging. How do we build a revolute for anything? So very exciting times ahead. I think that ultimately what excites me is that more and more people are focused on solving real problems and not only chasing just the money. And your question was twofold: was what types of technologies can be used, right? I said in the beginning, AI is a buzzword, but I also think that any company today, any job, any sector that does not see how it can leverage the power of artificial intelligence is not optimizing their processes and their potential to its maximum. So whether it's hardware technology, whether it's software technology, whether it's hydroponics, or what you want to call it, the number one thing we're excited about is more and more people know that there's capital available on the continent to resolve real problems, and that tech can help leapfrog and improve by 10x, 100x the experience, the production, the process of actually resolving that problem. And the fact that we're seeing more and more African VC firms with localized teams is a great sign. And I'm looking forward to working hand in hand with all those firms, all those players, and all my colleagues in the different firms.
Thank you so much, Haïlé. Firstly, for your time and also valuable insight that you've shared throughout the podcast. Where can a startup founder or anyone who's watching find you?
First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity, Kabuela, and allowing me to share my humble experience in what we do at Breega. And we have a website where you can send in a type form. So it's breega.com. That is breega.com. And otherwise on LinkedIn, Haïle Amegashie. I'm very, very active in LinkedIn in terms of looking at my inbound messages. So don't hesitate to reach out there. And my email address too is my first name, so Haïle Haile dot Amegashie Amegashie at Breega.com. So don't hesitate to send us a deck, ask questions. We're here to help. We're here to give guidance. And the truth is, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to invest in every founder, but our objective is to be able to give something, whether it's experience, whether it's an introduction, and why not? You guys becoming a portfolio company in Breega's Africa Fund.
Always grateful to our guests for making themselves available to come and share their deep insights. The scaling squad, I think, is a deep part value proposition of Breega, and I think it ties also in line with what we've been talking about, which is the mentor-driven capital as well. It's almost like at every stage, you're not just letting the founders fend for themselves, but you go on to provide this extra support to push them to really grow their companies 5x, 10x, let's 100x, right? And if you can have a scaling squad that supports them with that, I think that's super amazing. And so, yeah, thank you everybody that's just joined us on this episode. All of our 55 subscribers that we have on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other platforms where you can find us. Thank you so much. Please, everybody, as you leave, do not forget to hit that subscribe button. And we promise that's the best way you can support us. And we'll always promise to bring you the best guests that give you the most insights around what's happening across Africa. So thank you so much. And we'll see you next time on the next episode.